He didn't say a word. That's the part nobody wants to sit with. Drake didn't tweet it, didn't caption it, didn't put his name anywhere near it. He just tapped a little heart icon under a post from an Instagram page called We Love Hip Hop Network. And by doing that, he told you exactly how he feels about the man who ended his run at the top of hip hop. The post claimed Kendrick Lamar was never actually the threat, never the architect, never the one pulling the trigger. The post said Kendrick was a pawn, somebody else's pawn, Jay-Z's pawn to be exact, and Drake liked it. Now here's where I need you to slow down with me, because everything you think you understand about how this beef ended is about to get complicated. You think you watched two men fight it out and one of them lost. That's the story everybody accepted in real time. But what if the loser needs you to believe there was a third man in the room the whole time, moving pieces, so that losing to Kendrick Lamar doesn't actually count as losing to Kendrick Lamar? That is what this like button is quietly arguing. That is the entire function of that thumbs up. Personally, financially, this is a man 2 years removed from the worst professional beating of his career, still running defense in a courtroom over it. Culturally, this is a fan base that has been told for 2 years that the not like us era was a fluke, and now they're being handed a new theory to explain it away. Systemically, this is about who actually controls outcomes in this industry, who gets credit, and who gets erased from their own accomplishments by somebody else's cope. Stick with me, because by the time we get to the DJ Academics chessboard theory that this post is actually recycling, and by the time we get to what a federal judge said about Drake's own lawsuit just months ago, you are going to understand exactly why this like happened right now, at this specific moment, and not 1 day earlier. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Let's get everybody caught up, because if you've been following this story since the beginning, you know it did not start with a chess metaphor. It started with two artists, Aubrey Drake Graham and Kendrick Lamar, who had circled each other for over a decade before anything ever went public. Drake, the commercial king of the streaming era, the man who has broken more Billboard records than almost anyone breathing. Kendrick Lamar, the Pulitzer Prize-winning technician that the culture had crowned the greatest lyricist of his generation, but who had never, until that stretch in 2024, fully stepped into the role of a pop culture assassin. When the diss tracks started flying, it was framed exactly the way it should have been framed. Two men, one mic. Whoever landed the cleanest, most undeniable shot walks away with the crown. And Kendrick landed it. Not Like Us wasn't just a diss track, it became a genuine cultural event, a song people played at cookouts and weddings who couldn't tell you a single other lyric from either catalog. It swept the Grammys. It became the most talked about 7 minutes of music in recent hip-hop memory. And then, months after the actual battle had already been decided in the court of public opinion, Jay-Z tapped Kendrick to headline the Super Bowl halftime show, a stage that Roc Nation has controlled the keys to for years. That sequencing matters. It happened after, not during, not as some coordinated setup from the jump. But here's the tension that's been quietly simmering since that halftime show, and it's the tension this entire video sits on top of. Drake has never, not once, fully accepted the outcome of that battle on its own terms. He sued his own label. He's released 3 albums since, including one, Iceman, loaded with subliminal shots still aimed at a man he supposedly moved on from. And now, instead of talking about the bars, instead of talking about the numbers, he's co-signing a theory that removes Kendrick from the equation entirely and replaces him with a billionaire label boss who, by his own recent public statements, finds this entire narrative absurd. So the question hanging over this whole video is simple. If Jay-Z himself is out here in major press saying this doesn't make sense, why does Drake need it to be true so badly that he'll like a post making the claim for him? Let's start with what's actually sitting in plain sight, because this is the layer anybody with a phone in 5 minutes can go verify themselves. Piece of evidence number 1, and this is the one that kicked the whole cycle back up, the We Love Hip Hop Network Instagram post itself. The caption, paraphrased from the discussion in that clip, argues that we are past the dot era, that nobody's checking for Kendrick Lamar the way they used to, and buried in that same breath the claim that Kendrick was established as just one of Jay-Z's pawns the whole time. Drake liked it. Not shared, not quoted, liked. which, if you understand anything about how these platforms work, is actually the more damning move, because a like doesn't require justification. It's deniable until somebody screenshots it, and by then it's already done its job of feeding exactly what he wanted fed. Piece of evidence number 2, and this one is not new. It's actually the source material the entire post is recycling. DJ Academics has been running this exact theory for months, now publicly stating that every major beef Drake has ever had, from Pusha T all the way through to Kendrick, traces back to one common denominator, and that denominator is Jay-Z. Academics has literally described Drake's opponents as pawns on Jay-Z's chessboard, which means the post Drake liked isn't even an original claim. It's a recycled talking point from a media figure who has built an entire content ecosystem around convincing Drake's fans that their guy never actually lost to anyone. He was just outmaneuvered by a shadow puppet master they conveniently can't hold accountable in a beef because he never dropped a single bar. Piece of evidence number 3, and this one is not new at all. It's actually the source material the entire post is recycling. The timeline, when you actually lay it out date by date, wrecks this theory before it even gets out of the gate. The battle happened. The battle ended. Not Like Us swept the Grammys months later. The Super Bowl announcement came after that. Every single domino that people now point to as proof of a Jay-Z plan happened downstream of Kendrick already winning on his own. You cannot architect a conspiracy retroactively and then act like it explains the thing that already occurred before your supposed mastermind ever got involved. Piece of evidence number 4, and this is where it gets almost funny if it weren't so revealing. Drake's own legal team spent the better part of a year in federal court arguing something completely different from the pawn theory. They argued UMG, his own label, deliberately weaponized Not Like Us against him, using bots and manipulated marketing to inflate the song and destroy his reputation. That's a completely separate conspiracy from the Jay-Z used Kendrick as a pawn conspiracy. Does anybody else notice that? He's floated at least 2 different masterminds in 2 different years, and neither version of the story requires Kendrick Lamar to have actually beaten him fair and square. Is that not the most obvious tell in the world? A guy who keeps swapping out the villain in his own origin story because none of the villains he picks ever quite explain why he lost. And speaking of that lawsuit, because I promised you we were getting there, and oh, do I have more for you on this one. The stans who think this pawn narrative is some kind of gotcha are really not going to like what a federal judge already said about the exact type of thinking this post is built on. And we are getting into that contract structure and that ruling in full detail in just a few minutes because it directly undercuts the entire premise Drake just co-signed. Now let's go where the basic fan accounts don't go, because this is where you start hearing from people who are actually inside these rooms, not just reacting from the outside. First piece of cultural evidence. Jay-Z himself, in a new cover interview with GQ, was asked directly about the Drake and Kendrick beef, and he did not play along with the pawn theory even a little bit. He said the beef went too far, that it was bringing people's kids into it, and that he questioned whether battling needs to be part of the culture anymore. That is not the language of a man who orchestrated a war for his own benefit. That is the language of a man who watched something spiral past the point he was comfortable with and is now publicly on the record distancing himself from the aftermath. Second piece of cultural evidence, and this one is the direct rebuttal to everything Drake just liked. In that same interview, Jay-Z was asked point blank about the accusation that he masterminded the whole Super Bowl selection as some kind of coordinated takedown of Drake. His response? They drag everybody in it, like everyone's part of this conspiracy to undermine Drake, I guess. I'm fucking Jay-Z. All due respect to him, I'm fucking Hav. Respectfully, it doesn't make any sense. Let that sit for a second. The man being accused of running the entire operation just went on the record in a major national magazine calling the theory nonsensical, and he did it before Drake even liked this most recent post. So Drake liked to claim that the supposed architect of that claim had already publicly dismissed as absurd. Does that not tell you everything about how much research goes into these likes? Third piece of cultural evidence, and this is where it stops being just about optics and starts being about pattern.
Jay-Z explained exactly why he picked Kendrick to that stage, and it had nothing to do with any alliance or any long-term scheme against Drake. His words, "I chose the guy that was having a monster year. I think it was the right choice." That's a business decision. That's a promoter picking the artist with the hottest year in the culture to headline the biggest stage in American television. That is not a pawn being moved. That is a businessman making the most obvious call available to him. And framing it as anything deeper requires you to ignore literally every other artist Jay-Z has platformed over the years, based on merit and momentum, not manufactured beef outcomes. Fourth piece of cultural evidence, and I want to be fair here because there is a nuance worth acknowledging before I dismantle it. Jay-Z did admit something uncomfortable in that same conversation. He said he did benefit from Kendrick's win as the producer of that halftime show, and he acknowledged the hypocrisy of critiquing beef culture given his own history with Nas. Now, if you're a Drake fan, you might grab that and run with it, saying, see, he admitted he benefited. But benefiting from an outcome after the fact is not the same as engineering that outcome from the start. Every promoter, every network, every media outlet benefited from that beef in some way. That doesn't make all of them co-conspirators. It makes them opportunists reacting to something that already happened, which is the exact opposite of the pawn theory Drake just endorsed. Does anybody actually stop and think about how convenient this timeline is for Drake specifically? Every time this man's professional standing takes a hit, a new external villain appears just in time to absorb the blame. First, it was UMG and their marketing department. Now it's Jay-Z and a chessboard nobody but academics can actually see the pieces on. What's the next explanation going to be when this one runs out of steam? And does he even realize how transparent the pattern has become to everyone watching it happen in real time? Because here's where we have to shift gears completely, and I need you to buckle up for this part, because we're leaving the beef talk behind and going into the actual machinery underneath it, the stuff that never gets discussed on the surface level reaction channels.
Let's talk about the legal reality first, because this is the piece that exposes exactly how far Drake will go to avoid one simple word: accountability. In January of this cycle, Drake sued his own record label, Universal Music Group, over Not Like Us, arguing the label defamed him by promoting a song that called him a certified pedophile and alleging UMG used bots and manipulated marketing to inflate the song's success specifically to damage him. 10 months later, on October 9th, federal judge Jeanette Vargas dismissed the entire case, ruling that the war of words during a heated rap battle is exactly the kind of hyperbole that cannot be legally defamatory, because no reasonable listener expects verified factual claims out of a diss track. She specifically wrote that Drake himself had heavily implied Kendrick was a domestic abuser and suggested one of Kendrick's kids wasn't biologically his, meaning the court saw this as a two-way exchange of exaggerated insults, not a one-sided character assassination campaign engineered by a label. That ruling is systemic angle number one, and it matters because it establishes in a court of law that this entire beef was assessed as an organic artistic exchange, not a manufactured hit job. There was no finding of manipulation. There was no finding of a hidden third party controlling outcomes. There was a judge looking at 7 tracks of trash talk between 2 consenting adults in a genre built on exactly that kind of exchange and saying, this is just what rap battles look like. That's not my opinion. That's a federal ruling. Systemic angle number 2. Look at what Drake's team actually did after losing that ruling. They didn't accept it. They filed a 117-page appellate brief in January, taking the fight to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and UMG has already fired back with a response brief defending the original dismissal. 117 pages is not a quick correction. That's a full-scale legal offensive, which tells you this isn't about principle anymore, if it ever was. This is about a man who cannot let a single professional defeat exist on the public record without exhausting every available mechanism to reframe it. And when the legal mechanism stalls out in appellate court timelines that take months, if not years, to resolve, what's left?
cultural mechanisms, social media mechanisms, liking a post that does in 30 seconds what a 117-page brief takes months to attempt. Systemic angle number 3, and this is the piece that ties the whole business layer together, the label economics underneath all of this. Kendrick and Drake were, for years, on the same label ecosystem under UMG's umbrella, meaning the company had every financial incentive to maximize outcomes for both artists simultaneously, not orchestrate the downfall of one to elevate the other. UMG's own statement after the lawsuit dismissal made this explicit, saying the suit was an affront to all artists and their creative expression, and that they looked forward to continuing our work successfully promoting Drake's music. A label doesn't issue a statement like that about an artist they conspired against. They issue a statement like that about an artist whose paranoia just cost the company a year of legal resources defending itself against its own client. Every dollar UMG spent on that legal defense is a dollar that came out of a system that profits from both these men succeeding, which completely undercuts the idea that some grand architecture exists to benefit one artist at the total expense of the other. And does anybody remember what Drake was actually doing musically while all of this legal maneuvering was happening in the background? He dropped Iceman, an album where, according to multiple outlets tracking the lyrics line by line, he continued taking subliminal shots, specifically targeting Kendrick's conscious rap image, his activism, and his fan base. That's not a man who has moved past the beef. That's not a man treating this like ancient history. That's a man who 2 full years later is still recording bars about an opponent he supposedly no longer needs to think about, while simultaneously arguing in court and now on social media that the entire loss wasn't really his loss to own in the first place. So here's the truth bomb, and I want you to actually sit with this instead of scrolling past it, because this is the moment everything we've covered collapses into one single undeniable conclusion. Drake liking that post isn't about Jay-Z at all. It has never been about Jay-Z. This is a man who has now tried, in the span of roughly a year, 3 completely separate explanations for why he lost the biggest rap battle of the streaming era, and every single one of those explanations conveniently removes Kendrick Lamar as the actual author of that victory. First, it was UMG manipulating the marketing. That got thrown out of federal court with a judge calling parts of it logically incoherent. Then it was subliminal shots on his own album, trying to win the narrative retroactively through music nobody asked him to still be making about this beef. And now it's a co-signed social media theory that Kendrick was never even the real opponent, just a pawn moved by a billionaire who, in his own words, on the record in a national magazine, called that exact theory nonsensical. What we're actually watching, allegedly, according to the pattern of behavior across 2 years of documented public and legal record, is a man engaged in a slow-motion rewrite of his own history, testing which version of events his fan base will accept so he never has to say the 4 words that actually matter. I lost to Kendrick Lamar, not to a label conspiracy, not to bot manipulation, not to a chess piece controlled by Roc Nation, to Kendrick Lamar specifically, directly, on the merits, in front of the entire world, and then again at the Grammys, and then again on the biggest stage in American entertainment. Every excuse since has been an attempt to insert a middleman into a story that never had one. And the reason this matters so much for the culture is because if this rewrite succeeds, if enough people start repeating the pawn theory as accepted fact, we lose the ability to actually credit artistic excellence when we see it, because there will always be a conspiracy theory standing by to explain away the inconvenient truth that somebody was simply better that day. Let's bring this back down to what actually matters, because underneath all the legal filings and the recycled academics theories, this story has always had one center of gravity, and it's a man who has spent this entire 2-year saga doing the opposite of everything we just walked through. Kendrick Lamar didn't sue anybody. Kendrick Lamar didn't co-sign conspiracy theories about his opponent's team pulling strings behind the scenes. Kendrick Lamar wrote a song, dropped it, let it speak,
and then went and did his job at the Super Bowl at a level that will be studied for years. While Drake has been filing appellate briefs and liking Instagram posts, Kendrick has been quiet, which in this industry, in this specific era of oversharing and narrative management, is its own form of dominance. One man makes music that ends up in courtrooms, the other makes music that ends up in Grammy speeches and halftime show highlight reels.
Walk back through everything we covered, and it all reframes the same way. The lawsuit Drake filed against his own label wasn't proof of a conspiracy against him. It was proof that he needed a conspiracy to exist because the alternative was unbearable. The Jay-Z interview wasn't a confession of orchestration. It was the closest thing to a public correction we've gotten. A billionaire label boss going out of his way to say, on record, this theory doesn't make sense, respectfully. The Iceman subliminals weren't a comeback shot. They were a tell, evidence that 2 years later, this still isn't settled in Drake's mind the way he wants us to believe it is. And the like on that pawn post wasn't a bold statement. It was the quietest, most deniable version of a man still trying to convince himself more than anybody else that he didn't actually lose to the person everybody watched him lose to. Kendrick Lamar was never a pawn. There was no third man in that room. There were two artists, a battle, a winner, and a loser, who still, 2 years and multiple legal filings later, cannot bring himself to just take the L. And the beautiful, almost poetic part of all this is that the harder Drake works to rewrite that outcome, the more he proves exactly why he lost in the first place. Kendrick let the work speak. Drake is still talking. That contrast is the whole story, and it always will be. This is only the start of where this goes, because there are at least 2 things worth tracking closely from here. First, that appellate brief isn't going away quietly. UMG has already responded, and the Second Circuit's eventual ruling on this could either close this chapter for good, or, if it somehow goes Drake's way on a technicality, reopen a legal circus none of us are ready for. Second, keep an eye on whether Kendrick actually responds to any of this the way fans are speculating he might with new music before the year is out. Because if the "dot era is over" narrative gets punctured by an actual album drop, this entire pawn theory conversation evaporates overnight, and I promise you Drake's timeline is not ready for that. If you made it this far into the video, you already know how I feel about accountability, and you already know I'm going to keep tracking every single time this story tries to rewrite itself, because somebody has to. That's the job here. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe, because next up, I'm breaking down the actual JQ interview line by line, the one where Jay-Z casually drops a line about regretting his own beef with Nas that nobody's talking about yet. And trust me, there's a comparison in there between his and Kendrick's situation that's going to make you look at this entire timeline completely differently. Salute y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.